It's August 1977, midnight. The air inside 284 Green Street, a cramped council house in Enfield, London, is heavy and still. Peggy Hodgson stands frozen in the doorway of her daughter's bedroom. She's not listening to the silence. She's listening to the sound piercing it, the sharp, grating scratch of wood on linoleum. A heavy chest of drawers is shuddering, inching its way across the floor, all on its own. The only other sound is the caught breath of her 11-year-old daughter, Janet, a small gasp swallowed by a silence so profound you can hear your own pulse hammering in your ears. This story doesn't begin with a ghost. It begins with a family. Peggy Hodgson, a recently single mother, is doing her best to raise her 4 children: 12-year-old Margaret, 11-year-old Janet, 10-year-old Johnny, and 7-year-old Billy. Their life is one of making do, of stretching every penny, of finding comfort in the routine of school runs and bedtime stories. It's a normal, loving, vulnerable home. But that night, the ordinary walls of their house began to feel like they were holding a secret. It started subtly, as these things often do. A few nights before the chest moved, Janet and Margaret complained of their beds shaking. Peggy, exhausted, dismissed it as childish games. But then came the knocking. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, intelligent. The girls would clap a pattern, and from the wall, the same pattern would echo back. Knock, knock, knock. Peggy went into their room, annoyed, ready to tell them off, but their hands were under the blankets. The knocks continued. Her frustration curdled into fear. She grabbed the heavy chest of drawers and shoved it against the bedroom door, hoping to block whatever was happening. But as she pushed with all her might, she felt an immense, unseen force pushing back. The chest began to inch forward again, away from the door, as if guided by invisible hands. Panic set in. She gathered the children, and they fled downstairs. But the knocking followed them, echoing from the walls of the living room. Terrified, she ran next door to her neighbors, Vic and Peggy Nottingham. Vic, a burly builder, came over, skeptical but concerned. He stepped inside, and the house fell quiet. He searched the rooms, checked the pipes, found nothing. Probably just the pipes settling, he said, trying to reassure her. But as soon as he spoke, a loud series of knocks erupted from the wall right beside his head. He paled. He and his wife heard it all through the shared wall that night. The relentless, rhythmic banging. Convinced something was terribly wrong, they insisted Peggy call the police. When the police arrived, they expected a domestic dispute or a prank. Instead, they walked into a scene of quiet, baffling fear. UPC Carolyn Heaps was in the living room with Peggy when, right before her eyes, a heavy armchair lifted slightly and slid about 4 feet across the floor. She checked for wires, for tricks, for any logical explanation. There was none. She later signed a sworn statement, admitting she was frightened and could not account for the chair's movement. An officer of the law, a symbol of rational authority, had just witnessed the impossible. The incident was a turning point. The police could offer no help. Desperate, Peggy made a call to the Daily Mirror newspaper. The story of the strange happenings on Green Street began to ripple through the neighborhood. Whispers turned into gossip. The family, once just another household, was now the center of a chilling mystery. It felt as though whatever was inside the house, whatever was knocking on the walls and moving the furniture, wanted an audience. It was no longer content with just frightening a mother. and her children. It wanted attention. As that night wore on, a fragile quiet finally settled over 284 Green Street. The children were huddled under blankets in the front room, too scared to sleep alone. The phone line still seemed to crackle with the after effects of the call to the newspaper. The knocking had stopped. But then, from the top of the stairs, a new sound drifted down into the darkness. It wasn't a knock. It was a ragged, guttural scrape. The sound of a throat, dry and unused, trying to find its voice. By morning, strangers would be standing in their living room, and whatever lived in the walls would finally speak. Dawn breaks over Green Street, but it brings no relief. Inside number 284, the Hodgson family is worn thin, fatigue clinging to them like a second skin. Peggy's face is a complicated mask of embarrassment, hope, and absolute dread as she opens the door to the team from the Daily Mirror. Suddenly, the small house feels suffocatingly crowded, the air thick with anticipation and disbelief. The reporters set up their cameras, their professional skepticism barely concealed. Then it begins, not with a roar, but with a whisper of strangeness. A handful of marbles, sitting innocently in a plastic tub, suddenly arc through the air, clattering against the far wall. The photographers scramble, trying to capture the impossible. Moments later, a yellow Lego brick zips past a reporter's ear. They laugh it off, nervously, until a second brick flies with startling accuracy, striking the lead photographer square in the forehead. A welt rises instantly on his skin. The room falls deathly silent. The only sound is the click of his camera shutter, capturing nothing but the empty space where the brick came from. The journalists exchange uneasy glances. This isn't a prank. This feels different. Into this tense, bewildering scene steps a man named Maurice Grosse. He's not a journalist or a thrill seeker. He's a member of the Society for Psychical Research, an inventor by trade. But he carries a quiet, profound sadness. He recently lost his own daughter, a grief that has cracked his world open to possibilities others might dismiss. He arrives not as a savior, but as a meticulous witness. He sets up his tape recorders, opens his pristine notebooks, and most importantly, he looks at Peggy Hodgson and her children with genuine belief. For the first time, the family feels heard. Grosse isn't there to debunk or sensationalize. He's there to document, to listen. The days bleed into an endless siege. Normal life evaporates. The family abandons the upstairs bedrooms, dragging mattresses and blankets into the living room. They sleep together downstairs, a fortress of fear, with the lights burning all night and their shoes kept close, always ready to run. The house groans around them. Cold spots drift through the room like pockets of winter air. Sudden, violent bangs erupt from inside the walls, so loud it sounds like something is tearing through the plaster, swimming just beneath the surface. Fear becomes physical. Peggy constantly counts her children, her lips chapped from nervous biting. Janet's hands tremble so much she can barely hold a cup. This isn't just a haunting, it's a slow, grinding assault on their sanity. Maurice, ever the methodical investigator, tries to impose order on the chaos. He notices the knocks have a rhythm, a pattern. If there's someone here, can you knock once for no and twice for yes? He calls into the empty air. A pause. Then, from the wall behind the sofa, knock, knock. The children stare, wide-eyed. He begins teaching them to count the knocks, to ask questions. A strange, terrifying dialogue begins. How many people are in this room? Knock, 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 knock. 6. Correct. The house is responding. The call and answer becomes a chilling ritual, the tension tightening with every rap, like a drum being pulled taut before it splits. But the knocking is only the beginning. The focus of the activity seems to be 11-year-old Janet. She sits huddled in a corner, a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, a small comfort against the unrelenting cold of the house. There's a look in her eyes that doesn't belong to a child. It's weary, ancient. Grosse is asking another question to the room when Janet's head snaps back slightly. Her mouth opens, but the sound that emerges is impossible. It's not her voice. It's a low, guttural rasp, a gravelly rumble that seems to scrape its way out of her small throat. It's a sound a man would make, an old man. The tape recorder whirs, capturing the moment the case changes forever. The voice struggles, forcing out broken, breathy words that chill everyone to the bone. Just before I died. The audio recordings from that night captured a chilling moment. The gruff, disembodied voice speaking through Janet had trailed off, leaving an unfinished sentence hanging in the cold air. Now, with the tape recorder spinning, it finished the thought in a low, scratchy tone that didn't belong to a child. It said, I went blind, and then I had a hemorrhage, and I fell asleep, and I died in the chair. The room went silent. Peggy Hodgson stared at her daughter, disbelief warring with terror on her face. Her older daughter, Margaret, had tears streaming down her cheeks. Maurice Grosse, the investigator who had dedicated himself to this case, later admitted his pen faltered in his logbook. The words, he noted, were carefully attributed to the tapes he was making. This wasn't just knocks and bangs anymore. This was a story, a voice. It even gave itself a name, Bill. The evolution of the voice became a central focus. Its rasp grew deeper, its taunts more personal. It would bark insults and laugh at their fear. The investigators were desperate to prove it wasn't Janet faking it. They tried everything. They had Janet hold water in her mouth while the voice spoke, trying to see if her own vocal cords were being used. The water never moved. They asked it complex questions that a young girl couldn't possibly know the answers to. The voice answered. A speech specialist was even brought in, who suggested Janet might be using her false vocal cords, a dangerous technique that could permanently damage her larynx. This created a serious ethical tension. How far do you go to test a child who is already living in a state of constant terror? Where does investigation end and exploitation begin? As the case grew more complex, another investigator, Lyon Playfair, joined Maurice Grosse. Together, they brought a new level of discipline to the inquiry. They were building a case file, a meticulous record of the impossible, their logbooks filled with dates, times, and detailed descriptions. They drew floor plans, marking where every incident occurred. They cordoned off rooms with tape, turning the small council house into a paranormal laboratory. The house was filled with the constant, tactile sounds of their investigation. The sharp click of the tape recorder starting, the scratch of a pen, the red tally marks Grosse used to count every single anomalous event. Their most contested verification came from this disciplined work. Grosse would later state that a man named Terry Wilkins came forward. He confirmed that his father, Bill Wilkins, had indeed lived in that house. And more chillingly, he confirmed that his father had died of a cerebral hemorrhage while sitting in his favorite armchair in the living room, the very same chair. It was a stunning piece of information, one that seemed to validate everything the family and the investigators had experienced. The story, from the voice, the name, the cause of death, it all clicked into place, recorded on tape and documented in their notes. But the story wasn't that simple. As word of the Enfield Poltergeist spread, so did the skepticism. Even within the Society for Psychical Research, there were doubters. Another investigator, Anita Gregory, spent time in the house and left convinced it was a hoax. Stage magicians looked at the famous photographs of Janet levitating and pointed out that they could easily be explained as a well-timed jump off the bed. Then came the most damaging evidence. The girls were caught faking. On one occasion, a hidden video camera recorded Janet bending spoons and trying to bang a broom on the ceiling herself. When confronted, the family gave an exhausted, morally gray confession. Yes, sometimes they did play tricks. They explained that the phenomena were so frequent, but not always on demand. When investigators or reporters were there, waiting for something to happen, the pressure was immense. So, they would sometimes push it along, faking a minor event, because they knew a real one would happen eventually anyway. Does a desperate attempt to be believed invalidate the entire experience? Just as skepticism threatened to dismantle the case, the house unleashed a new level of violence. One night, as Grosse and Playfair were documenting, a terrifying chaos erupted from the girl's bedroom. As Playfair later wrote, the heavy cast iron fireplace, a fixture that had been cemented into the wall for decades, was partially torn from its moorings. It tilted forward, spilling soot and debris onto the carpet as the children screamed in pure terror. The soundscape was horrifying, the pop and crack of masonry being ripped apart, the shower of falling plaster, and underneath it all, the harsh barking laugh of the voice, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a brutal display of force that defied any explanation of two young girls faking it. In the dark, dusty aftermath, the investigators decided it was no longer safe for Janet to sleep in her own room. They made a bed for her on the sofa downstairs, hoping the distance would offer some protection. As the house finally fell quiet and Janet drifted into an uneasy sleep, a thin curtain cord that had fallen to the floor began to move, snaking silently across the floorboards toward her. She felt a breath on her cheek, and a hoarse, triumphant whisper slithered directly into her ear. Got you. It's late 1978. The house on Green Street has become a fortress under siege. Bedrooms look like campsites, mattresses dragged into a single room for safety. Crucifixes, borrowed and bought, now sit on every windowsill, silent sentinels against the night. Stacks of notebooks are piling up on the floor, filled with Maurice Grosse's meticulous logs of every knock, every thrown object, every whisper. And the voice, it's changed. It's no longer just a rasping old man. It's foul-mouthed now, cruel, spitting insults that slice through the cold air. Sometimes it becomes terrifyingly coherent, weaving sentences together with a chilling intelligence before dissolving back into a guttural growl. The pressure is constant, a tight band around your chest that never loosens. One evening, the pressure snaps. Janet is standing by the window when the curtain suddenly writhes, twisting around her like a living thing. The fabric engulfs her, pulling her off her feet. The heavy cord whips around her neck, tightening cinching. She's being dragged upwards, feet kicking uselessly in the air. Peggy screams. Maurice Grosse lunges forward, shouting Janet's name, his hands clawing at the knot that's strangling her. Her face is turning purple. Her gasps are ragged. And through it all, a sound rides the chaos, a low, raspy cackle, like an old smoker laughing at a private, vicious joke. This is it. This is the moment the house nearly takes a life. For a few frantic seconds, they thought they were going to lose her. Then, as quickly as it began, the cord loosens, and Janet collapses to the floor, coughing and sobbing. But just when you think you have a handle on this story, it slips through your fingers. Amidst the terror, other investigators visit. Anita Gregory and John Beloff, both members of the Society for Psychical Research, arrive with skepticism in their eyes, and they see something else entirely. They catch the girls, Janet and Margaret, in a back room, bending spoons with their hands, whispering about how to trick the investigators. Gregory later reports seeing a metal bar fly across the room, only to realize Janet had likely thrown it herself. Suddenly, the narrative is fractured. The same house that almost strangled a child is also a stage for childish pranks. How do you reconcile these two truths? A near fatal assault one day, and a bent spoon the next? The story refuses to be simple. The chaos even draws the attention of paranormal investigators from across the Atlantic, Ed and Lorraine Warren. They show up, reportedly uninvited, stay for a day, and declare the house infested with something demonic and inhuman before leaving just as quickly. But their visit is a footnote. The real work, the grueling, night after night vigil, remains with Grosse and Guy Playfair. They are the ones spending sleepless nights, counting disembodied knocks, drawing complex diagrams to map the trajectory of flying objects, and speaking to the entity that has taken over the house. And that entity still insists its name is Bill. Grosse, desperate for any solid piece of evidence, continues down this path. He tracks down a man named Terry Wilkins, whose father, Bill Wilkins, had once lived and died in that very house. Over a crackling phone line, Terry confirms the unthinkable. Yes, his father passed away in that house. He had a brain hemorrhage while sitting in his favorite armchair in the corner of the living room. Maurice Grosse holds the receiver, listening, the plastic feeling like a lifeline in a sea of pure chaos. It's the closest thing to an anchor he's found, a verifiable fact in a world that has dissolved into madness. But that confirmation doesn't stop the torment. For the Hodgson family, the haunting has become a prison. The children are taunted at school, called freaks and liars. Social workers are now regular visitors. Their clipboards and probing questions, just another layer of invasion. Peggy's hands shake every time she has to sign another statement for another official, a testimony she never wanted to give about a life she never asked for. They can't just pack up and leave. This is a council house. They have nowhere else to go. Their poverty has trapped them here, with the haunting as their unrelenting guard. After nearly 2 years of this relentless siege, something begins to shift. For almost a week, the house falls strangely quiet. The knocks cease. The furniture stays put. A fragile, unfamiliar peace settles over the rooms. The family starts to breathe again, daring to hope it's finally over. But it's a false dawn. The silence is broken not by a whisper, but by a roar. A wardrobe is thrown across the room with violent force. The guttural laughter returns, louder and more malicious than ever. The entity is not gone. It was just gathering its strength for one final terrifying escalation. The house is holding its breath, and it's about to unleash everything it has left. The nights became a storm of noise. Investigators' tapes captured a relentless barrage of knocks, like a hailstorm against the walls. A heavy table would suddenly skitter across the linoleum floor, propelled by an unseen force. Objects would fly from shelves and slam into the plaster, while the disembodied voice ranted itself hoarse, a torrent of anger and confusion. For the Hodgson family, the terror had long since faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness, a numb endurance against a siege that never seemed to end. They were beyond fear. They were just surviving, minute by minute, in a house that had become their tormentor. Then, as 1979 began to unfold, the storm started to break. The uncoiling was slow, almost imperceptible at first. The violent outbursts became less frequent, the knocking softer, the voice quieter. Over weeks, then months, the frantic energy that had gripped 284 Green Street seemed to ebb away. During this time, Janet was admitted to the renowned Maudsley Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Doctors ran extensive tests, searching for any explanation, any anomaly that could account for what was happening. But the results were inconclusive. There were no hidden signs of a disorder, no clear medical answers. When Janet finally returned home, the house felt different. It was still, quiet. The oppressive presence had lifted, as if some volatile energy had finally burned itself out, leaving only a strange, unsettling silence in its wake. The aftermath wasn't a return to normal, but a new kind of quiet. The living room was a patchwork of memories, with mismatched chairs filling the space and freshly patched plaster covering the scars where the old fireplace had been torn from the wall. Peggy Hodgson could now make a cup of tea in the kitchen without a knife flying past her head. The children were older, their faces carrying a shadow of what they had endured, but they were learning to sleep through the night again. The house was no longer a war zone, but the peace felt fragile, haunted by the memory of the chaos. Decades later, the legacy of the Enfield Poltergeist remains fiercely contested. Maurice Grosse and Lyon Playfair, the lead investigators, left Enfield convinced they had documented a genuine case of paranormal activity. Skeptics, however, were never swayed. They pointed to inconsistencies and moments of admitted fakery. Years later, as adults, both Janet and Margaret admitted they had faked some of the phenomena to test the investigators, or simply out of a childish desire to see if they could get away with it. Yet, they both firmly stood by their core experiences, insisting that the most terrifying events were real and beyond their control. Janet, in particular, maintained that she never sought fame and wished none of it had ever happened. Peggy Hodgson, the family's matriarch, lived out the rest of her life in that house, passing away in the same living room in 2003. Subsequent residents have been notoriously private, though a few have anonymously reported a lingering feeling in the house, a sense of not being entirely alone. No definitive verdict was ever reached. It remains a tangled web of belief and doubt, a story where the truth is as elusive as a shadow. And what of Bill, the gruff voice that claimed to have died in the house? Perhaps the most chilling piece of the puzzle came when his alleged son was tracked down. He reportedly confirmed that his father, Bill Wilkins, had indeed died of a cerebral hemorrhage while sitting in a chair in the downstairs living room of that very house. It leaves us in a gray area, a space where multiple truths might coexist. Could it be that grief and a craving for attention, childhood trauma, and clever trickery, and something genuinely, inexplicably strange all converged at 284 Green Street? In the end, the real disaster wasn't a ghost or a demon. It was a family trapped, their home turning against them. It was a disaster measured in years of sleepless nights, frayed nerves, and a childhood stolen by the disbelief and scrutiny of adults. In Enfield, the house didn't burn down, and the earth didn't swallow it whole. It simply refused to be a home.